What is up? Welcome to another edition of the Fantasy Life Podcast. I am Marcus Grant, joined by Dwayne McFarland, and we have officially reached the start of the NFL playoffs. Super wild card weekend, I believe is what they're calling this now. Dwayne, doesn't matter what they're calling it. We're just excited for playoff football. I know we talked about it a little bit earlier in the week. This is when sort of everything ratchets up. The stakes are higher. The excitement is greater. I mean, we got plenty to talk about, but let's just bring on some football, right?
Yeah, man. Football is always super. And when we get to the playoffs and you're forcing good teams to be playing each other and we don't have as many of the matchups, because throughout the season that happens. You just get sometimes a really good team playing a really bad team. Now, some of these playoff teams are pretty banged up, so we'll get to them. Maybe do they really belong in the playoffs? Maybe not at this exact moment, but this is where we are. And overall, we do have a nice slate this weekend. So yeah, we mentioned it on the last show. Like, this is the time of year where I really I'm still playing contests. I'm doing, best ball. I'm doing DFS. I'm doing all these things, but without having my normal season long grind, because I usually have so many teams I'm managing, like I have this moment just to kind of breathe it all in and be like, just watch football, and just, enjoy the game, because that's what got me into fantasy football. Like when I first started, loving the NFL, like I didn't know anything about fantasy football. Like that came second. So I love it when we get to the playoffs. I kind of go back to more of that original state when I first fell in love with the game.
Right, absolutely. And it's funny, you talk about, the season-long grind, so to speak. And, while we always want to win and you want to go as far as you can in the season, there is something sort of a little bit relieving when there's like, okay, that's one less lineup I have to check off every single week.
Yeah.
It's like one less thing on the agenda every week. But we got plenty on the agenda today. We're going to go through some rankings. Of course, you can check those out over at fantasylife.com. Also, because it's the playoffs, we're going to preview the matchups that we have coming up this weekend, the 6 different games on the slate. We'll go through those one by one. Plus, a new segment that we're going to do throughout the offseason here. We're calling it Fantasy Fixers. Of course, you can find that on the website at fantasylife.com. We're going to do sort of an audio-video companion to that, where we talk about the teams that didn't make the playoffs and what they need to do to kind of get themselves right for next year and beyond. But let's start with, I guess, a goodbye to speak. Derek Carr is no longer going to be a Las Vegas Raider. I think we sort of knew that, Dwayne, with the way the season ended. He was benched for the last 2 games of the year. They went with Jarrett Stidham instead, but he has officially said goodbye to the team. His agent put out a statement this morning basically saying that his time with the Raiders was finished and that he's earned the right to go somewhere else. So let's look up some potential landing spots here, right, for Derek Carr. Where could he go? You listed 3 of them here that I think are really good. One, the Saints. They don't have a first-round pick to trade, but they do have a needed quarterback. I mean, I don't know what the future is for Andy Dalton or Jameis Winston. Derek Carr with Chris Olave, maybe with a healthy Michael Thomas if he's back. That could be a nice fit there in New Orleans for him, couldn't it?
Yeah, and I think, honestly, they're not getting a first-round pick for Carr. Like, I don't think it's going to happen because there's so many quarterbacks, and the teams that need quarterback that have high draft picks, right? You've got the Houston Texans at 2. You've got the Indianapolis Colts at 4. Even like, one of the teams, we'll talk about the other 2 here in a minute. Like there's a couple teams on this list that are just further down, or at least a team that might trade a first round pick. They're not going to trade a high one, obviously, right, for Carr. But the Raiders do have an out here. They are exploring all of their options, but there's also a chance they just release him, because they have an out this year. They have to do this before the 2023 waiver, league calendar starts, which I believe is it's right after the Super Bowl. I want to say it's February 15th. I would have to double check that. So they don't have a big window here. Like they either have to get him moved and take whatever they can for him, right? Or they're going to have to just let him go if they want to move on. So I think knowing that, another team's not going to give a high pick. So the way I kind of made this list is just looking at the teams that we know need a quarterback, but they're not really in position to get one of the top 3 in the draft. And so the Saints were number 1 because you mentioned it. They don't have a first round pick. It's funny, like looking back now, like you guys should go look this up. Essentially everything they traded for Chris Olave, who we love, but it's multiple picks is what this all came down to by the time, the Saints traded back up and everything. So yeah, and Jordan just confirmed it is February 15th is the date that they've got to make this decision on Carr. But looking at the Saints, because of Chris Olave, I would like to see an upgrade. Like Andy Dalton was serviceable this year, but I do think Derek Carr would be a clear upgrade, right, over Andy Dalton. I think he could potentially fit their style of play as well. They seem to be a team that They would like to rely on their defense as much as they can. They would like to, be efficient on offense, but they don't necessarily want to be a pass-heavy team. I think getting someone like a Derek Carr is probably the best we can hope for right now to potentially unlock Chris Olave a little more than what we saw with Dalton.
Right. That's what we would hope. Also, Derek Carr, if you do land in New Orleans, please involve Alvin Kamara some more in the passing game too. We would certainly appreciate that.
He will do that. We've seen him be a check down. We've seen him be a check down meister, right, in the past, like for sure. So, in fact, remember there was a narrative at one time like Derek Carr just never is going to throw downfield. He's always going to check it down. So, I do think that would be a positive to your point as well for Alvin Kamara, pending legal situations there.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That's another issue that is possibly going to pop up there. You talk about the check down thing. That was, an issue when they had Amari Cooper, which seems like eons ago that Amari Cooper was a Raider. It just seemed like they never used him to push the ball down the field. The Jets, another team potentially in the market for a quarterback. I know Robert Saleh has said they plan to stick with Zach Wilson. They plan to stand by him and allow him to maybe continue to grow. I think most of Twitter looked at that and said, yeah, we don't really believe you. So the Jets very much could be in the market for a quarterback. They are right now locked into the 13th spot in the draft, provided they don't try to move up or anything like that. Derek Carr, maybe that would be a good spot. I mean, I feel like they are a quarterback away from really doing big things in New York. Derek Carr might be the answer to kind of unlock that potential there.
Yeah, I agree. They've got a really good defense. They've got another Ohio State receiver. We just talked about Chris Olave. You've got Garrett Wilson there. You've got Elijah Moore, who definitely took a step back this last season. You have Corey Davis as your third wide receiver. I'd have to check Davis's contract. I can't remember how long his was for, but they've got a nice core. They've got some okay tight ends with Conklin, Uzama, and obviously we're going to get Breece Hall back next year. So it's an offense with everything set up, right? That, can Derek Carr just come in and basically keep it, moving? It's, again, another stylistically good match probably, right? Where they don't necessarily want to be, hey, we're going to throw the ball all the time. They want to be somewhere in the middle. They want to rely on the ground game as well. So yeah, I like the Jets. I think that's a good one. I think they're just outside of the range of where you're going to get, one of the top quarterbacks this year in the draft.
Yeah. Corey Davis, by the way, signed through next year. He'll be an unrestricted free agent in 2024. So at least one more year of Corey Davis there in New York. The last team on this list, the Washington Commanders, kind of a similar situation to the Jets. They are at pick 16, so probably out of the range of that top tier of quarterbacks there. I was sort of joking with some friends who are Raiders fans that, maybe Derek Carr goes to Washington. He helps uplift that offense. And then the Raiders, as a short-term stopgap, they bring in maybe a Carson Wentz or a Baker Mayfield. My friends did not like that suggestion. But Washington, I think, in a similar situation to the Jets, where they've got talent, they've got wide receivers there. They just need that consistency at quarterback to maybe unlock some of those guys.
Maybe the real takeaway here is you just draft an Ohio State receiver in the first round, Jackson
Right.
Smith and Jigba, because we have another Ohio State receiver that needs someone to support them here, and that's Terry McLaurin. So yeah, the Commanders very similar to your point. And again, you've got a nice young core of weapons. I mean, Curtis Samuel, another Ohio State player,
right there.
is not necessarily young, but he's not old either. And then, you got Jahan Dotson, first round pick out of Penn State. There, we get a different college in there last season. So, with that young core like that, and then Logan Thomas is decent, as a decent tight end. I think there's plenty, to like here if you're someone like Derek Carr, and he has a no trade clause. So if he were to be traded to any of these, he's got to sign off. So that's the other component. Like if I were him, I would be looking at the Jets and the Commanders if I got to have my say, because New Orleans is a roster that it's getting pretty old outside of Olave, probably trending in the wrong direction. The Jets, still a younger, that's a roster that's on the upswing. The Commanders, that's an offense that I think on offense at least, you could argue that it's on the upswing as well with McLaurin, with Dotson, with Curtis Samuel. So I think those are all ideal spots where they're not quite in right now. These teams, besides the Saints, they could all trade up, to try to get back in the young quarterback race. But I think he would make sense in these spots.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because we talked about the Bears very much in the catbird seat right now at the number one spot, and for the moment feeling like they've got a quarterback, so they can certainly field a lot of offers from a lot of teams, and who knows, maybe one or both or all three of these teams decide to throw their hat in the ring.
If Carr went to any of these, and that was the other part of thinking through, right? There's everything has a fantasy angle. Like, I would feel not great about the weapons on these teams, but I would feel comfortable. I would feel comfortable drafting them because we know we just watched Derek Carr support an elite receiver and Devontae Adams. Yeah, Derek Carr got benched at the end of the season, but you were fine with Devontae Adams. He was awesome. So we know that Carr can support the offenses. He's not a good enough quarterback to probably make them change their offense to where all of a sudden now they're going to be a pass-heavy team, but he is good enough to support probably two weapons on all of these teams. We didn't necessarily get to see that with the Raiders this year, but remember, Waller and Hunter Renfrow were both hurt. And Devontae Adams is a true alpha. He demands so much. It's hard to really find another weapon that can survive in that kind of, environment. Maybe Garrett Wilson turns into that, but I don't, Olave could as well. But at the end, we just know he's good enough to support, the weapons. He may not totally change the offense, but we can feel comfortable with the fantasy options.
And I think what Carr brings is sort of that week-to-week consistency. It's more of a steadiness, whereas when you looked at the Jets, looked at the Commanders, how we felt about their wide receivers on a week-to-week basis depended a lot on who the quarterback was, right? I mean, we were gung-ho on Garrett Wilson when it was Mike White. We were a little bit more apprehensive when it was Zach Wilson, and same thing in Washington. When it was Taylor Heineke, we felt a lot better about Terry McLaurin than we did when it was Carson Wentz. So even if you don't love Derek Carr as a fantasy option, you feel like he brings just a steadiness to the offense that you can count on the wide receivers on a weekly basis. That feels like a good spot to kind of talk about some of what's going to happen this weekend. Of course, you can go check out everything you want to know about all the games this weekend on the Game Hub. Go check it out at fantasylife.com, where it is, as I always say, the one-stop shop for everything you want to know, whether you're playing DFS, whether you're in a playoff bracket, if you're playing over-unders, all that sort of stuff. It's got all the information you want. So always building, always adding more information. I mean, these things have grown and evolved, Dwayne. It's been kind of fun to kind of watch this thing sort of take on a life of its own over the course of the season.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of cool things about working here at Fantasy Life. I was at PFF before this, but I think one of my favorite things is how quickly we've built these tools and how iterative the process has been, and constantly tweaking them. But to your point, like with the Game Hub, like if you go look at it right now, especially like on this slate where it's playoffs, it's just so clean. Just if you go to the homepage, you quickly see, here are all the games. You get all of the, betting information as far as the game totals, the lines, all of that. We're keeping up to date for you. You get a matchup rating, whether it's good, great, whatever the case may be. And you quickly see where does our staff, where do the experts already have their picks in? So like right now, we know the first game of the weekend, we'll be talking about here in a minute, the Seahawks at the 49ers. And you can see there are 3 picks that are already in. You just easily can click on that button and you can go in and you can see like, what is our staff thinking? And you'll see that Mark actually has the San Francisco 49ers with 1 unit on the odds of covering, the game. So yeah, I mean, everything's there. And then you got player props, you got the fantasy data, you've got game write-ups. So again, one central spot. And that's why they call it the hub, I guess, because it's a hub of all this information. So that all makes sense.
It does make, we've put it together. We have solved the mystery of why they call it the Game Hub. Let's start though with that 40, or actually let's start with the rankings here. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at quarterback though for the weekend. Kirk Cousins going against the New York Football Giants, which still makes me laugh because the baseball Giants left New York like 60 years ago. I don't think there's any confusion.
I think Chris Berman's keeping that alive.
I think he really. Although here's funny, I haven't called their offices in a long time, but I called their offices, a few years ago, and they answered the phone, New York Football Giants, and I was confused because I didn't think I have, accidentally called the baseball Giants. But anyway, that's a different story. Kirk Cousins, who finished the regular season as the QB7. And I mean, I feel like Kirk Cousins played to his reputation this year, whereas, in the good matchups, he was pretty good. In the bad matchups, he was not so good. You just, you kind of based your Kirk Cousins love on who was lining up across from him. This week against the Giants, who've been, so-so. How do you feel about Kirk Cousins in this playoff matchup?
Yeah, I think, on a macro perspective, like QB7 is really good. No one had Kirk Cousins inside their top. Most people did not have Kirk Cousins inside their top 12 to start the season as far as fantasy rankings go. Mm-hmm. So I think he outperformed actually what people expected. Now his fantasy points were very similar to last year. He's pretty much a 300-point quarterback every season. He's right around that again this year. But if you didn't have Patrick Mahomes, if you didn't have Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow, that's clearly tier one. Justin Fields would have been in that tier if he had been healthy the whole time. So you can go ahead and throw him up there. But after that, like really Cousins is in the mix. Like if you didn't have one of those guys, you felt pretty good about having Kirk Cousins. You did mention it, Marcus. It's been a little bit of a up and down roller coaster, but that's kind of the way it goes with a lot of these players that are not in that top tier, right? So you're not necessarily getting someone that's far more steady if we look at other options on the list. Like Justin Herbert's had to battle, he's had his own battles, right? Trevor Lawrence has had hot streaks, but he's also had his battles. So Kirk Cousins is really in the same vein as those guys, but overall he's performed better than them from a fantasy perspective this season. And if you look at the offense for the Vikings, he's got the weapons, right? We've got Justin Jefferson, you've got Adam Thielen, KJ Osborne has really come on over the last several games. Like he's got three top 13 finishes in the last 4 games. So he's a guy that they really like to lean into whenever they play against man coverage. He sees an increase in targets, and that's what we're going to see this weekend. You're playing against the Giants, who are the second most man heavy coverage team in the NFL. And they are also really bad in coverage. They have the worst graded PFF coverage unit in the playoffs at 52.1. So when you get those two things together and you're going to get these one-on-ones and that they can't cover, like that's usually a really good thing. And so in week 16, we did see Kirk Cousins drop 299 yards and 3 passing touchdowns on the New York Football Giants, Marcus.
Right.
And Cousins registered his highest PFF passing grade of the season that weekend with a 90.7. So, yeah, I feel really good about him. The Vikings throw the ball above the league average in every game script. When they're trailing, they rank 4th. When they're in close games, so that's within 3 points, they rank 5th. Leading by 4 or more points, they rank 5th. So we know they're going to throw the ball. They've got the matchup. They've got receivers that can beat the man coverage. I really like it. And it's also a game like Vegas likes this game this weekend. When you look at it, and you look at all the game totals across, the slate, this is one of the best ones. And it has a real chance to blow up. It also is only a 3, the Vikings are only favored by 3. So it should be really competitive. And it's a game where I could see myself creating a lot of stacks for DFS.
Yeah, I think so. I love your description, though, of the Giants. It's like they don't play any zone. They make up for it by being bad at man. That's I think that pretty much sums up the Giants' pass defense. This is one where you look at the Vikings. And I know we'll talk about the matchup a little bit later. I expect this to be close, mainly because the Vikings don't seem to play in a lot of blowouts, I guess, except for that last week against the Packers.
Yeah,
but I guess week 17 against the Packers. But I think this is going to be a close one. Let's look at Saquon Barkley, who I came into this year really being a believer in Saquon. I talked about the Saquon-assance and feeling like as long as he stayed healthy, that he was going to be back to being explosive again. And that is what we saw over the majority of the season. He had a couple of down weeks maybe in the middle, but for the most part, he looked like the Saquon Barkley that we all fell in love with his first couple of years in the NFL. You think he's back to being a tier 1 guy that we'll be talking about him when we come to drafts next year in the same breath as we talk about Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler next season?
Well, I think we'll have to see where he lands. But yeah, I think the skill set is there. We know that he can be an every down back. And and when we say every down, you're out there on early downs, pounding it between the tackles. You're out there in long down and distance when they want you to pick up blitzes. You're out there in the 2-minute offense when you're going to get, 3 or 4 check downs on one drive, to end a half. Like he gets to play all of those roles. And you mentioned it. The explosiveness was really there more early in the season. Had some injury things, nothing huge, but, just the toll of the NFL season. Middle of the year, was not quite as efficient, has been a little more efficient again here towards the end. I do think it's in question whether or not he has that rookie season explosiveness. I mean, that was just nuts. Probably not quite, back to that level yet for Barkley, but playing really well and someone you can trust all of the time. So hopefully with Barkley, like what we don't want to see is like, how these teams do us, Marcus. A team like the Jets will sign him. You're like, what are you doing? He's tall. Like that's the kind of stuff these teams do to us. Like, so please, like I shouldn't even put that into the universe. Like that was just bad. That's my bad. Anyone listening, you're probably cringing right now. I apologize in advance. So with Barkley though, this weekend, I moved him into the top tier. Usually my top tier, like it's pretty, exclusive. It's McCaffrey and Eckler and anyone else that really has like just a crazy matchup, and maybe their favorites, things like that. And with Barkley this weekend, just looking at him, over the last several games, I mean, he's averaging 19 points over the last 3. That's right in line with McCaffrey and Eckler, who are around 20. If you look at him against the Vikings, here we are back to the same matchup. We just talked about Kirk Cousins. I talked about stacking this game. If you look at it, the last time Barkley played against the Vikings, which was just a few weeks ago in week 16, he had 84 yards and a rushing touchdown. And he had 10 targets, Marcus. So the Vikings are the opposite of the Giants. They want to play zone, and they play the third most zone in the NFL, 77% on the season. They have used a little more man over the last few games, but in games where Barkley gets to see that sort of coverage, his targets per route run jumps to 21%. So that's 6 percentage points above what we typically see for him when he plays against man coverage. And that's normal. Like, if you play against a team that's going to use a lot of zone, you're going to see more passes to tight ends, and you're going to see more passes to running backs, and things are generally a little more spread out. You won't see a lot of times you won't see a 35% target share to a receiver unless your name's Deebo Samuel. Deebo definitely gets that. Chris Godwin gets that. There's a few that do. But then when you go against man, if you've got an alpha wide receiver, typically they'll see way more. Running backs go down, tight ends go down, unless your name's Travis Kelce, guys like that. It doesn't really matter for them. So it's just an interesting dynamic on the two sides of this game. You've got on one side, you've got the Giants playing man coverage, and they're terrible at it. That's great for Justin Jefferson and Kirk Cousins, KJ Osborne. On the other side of it, you have the Giants playing zone all the time. They are also terrible at it. So, I mean, they're both bad secondaries. It's just a matter of how it creates these matchups for the players, right, on the opposing side. And this is a good spot for Barkley.
Definitely a good spot for Barkley. And, as you got into, like, the usage for him, there aren't a lot of guys who can match that when he's healthy and ready to go. So that definitely puts him in the conversation of being a top-tier guy next year. And hopefully we see some of that on display this week. Tony Pollard has been very good in sort of a shared role there in Dallas. Did not have a great week 18. The Cowboys in general just did not have a great week 18. The Bucs, they have not been, I think, what people expected them to be this year, but defensively, there's still something to kind of pay attention to. Does he bounce back this week? Does he get those opportunities? Or does this become sort of a slugfest between these two clubs?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, right? Because if you look at Pollard and the first 4 games after we got Zeke back, Zeke had missed a few games where Pollard had kind of gone nuclear. And we were like, oh, well, can Pollard keep it up? Zeke's coming back. That was in week 11. He just turns around and goes RB1 overall. That first game with Zeke back. Yeah, RB41, but then RB2, then RB7, right? And so since then, the production has slipped a little bit. He's had an RB18 finish, RB16, and then RB74 in a really nasty game, against the Commanders. He also missed a game in there. He missed week 17 due to a quad or thigh injury. And then it's a scenario where when he was exploding, despite having Zeke back, there was always this, and we talked about actually in the Fantasy Life newsletter, the regression session. It talked about the fact that, look, can Pollard really keep up scoring all the touchdowns? Because in a 4-game span, after Zeke returned, he scored 6. So like it's just tough to do that. We're seeing it right now with Jerick McKinnon. But on the other side of it, you're also like, okay, but Pollard's a really explosive player. Pollard plays a lot. He plays a lot on passing down still. He has an edge over Zeke in that area, just like McKinnon. They're very similar guys. The only thing that's making people rank McKinnon higher than Pollard right now is McKinnon's done it more recently. McKinnon is in a 4-game stretch like Pollard was a month ago. And so when I look at things like that, and yes, he was due for regression, but he has all the other things going for him. Now the Cowboys need to snap out of this. To your point, can this thing just turn into a slugfest? I don't know. Like the Bucs defense isn't quite as good, as what it was. Like we'll talk about that more when we get to the matchup previews. But for me, the bottom line here is Pollard still has this super high upside. It's not gone. His role has not changed at all, really, from the time that we saw him explode for those games. It just hasn't really worked out in his favor over the last 4 games. He hasn't had these huge outings. Over the last 3 games. 4 games ago, he was at 22.2 fantasy points. You'll take that all day long. But the rushing attempts, the role in the passing game, getting short down and distance work, like all of that is still there for Pollard. So he has paths to all the avenues that you want. And then he has the skill set on top of it. Would we rather him have all the stuff? Yeah. And Zeke, if Zeke wasn't there, yeah, that would be great. But we don't. But my big point is like a lot of people are just kind of like they don't want to click on Pollard right now just because he didn't do it in week 18. So I think you got to fade the recency bias. There's a really like he could still be the RB1 on the slate.
Yeah, we are very much victims, I think, to recency bias a lot of times, and I think your example of Jerick McKinnon versus Tony Pollard is certainly a great example because McKinnon scoring a lot of touchdowns, scoring a lot of fantasy points, but you look and especially last week, I know it was week 18, and that kind of skews things, but his usage wasn't that great. We saw a lot of Ronald Jones, we saw a lot of other guys getting involved, and as you mentioned earlier in the week, Clyde Edwards-Helaire could be back, so that could maybe take some of the shine off McKinnon possibly. Pollard, we know it's just him and Ezekiel Elliott in that backfield, which, side note to that, does Pollard come back to Dallas next year? Does he get franchised? Do they try to sign him? Just your best guess of what happens with Tony Pollard next year.
Going to be very interesting. They're 1 year away from being out from under the Zeke deal. So just how do they want to make all this stuff work? Because you can see a path where if you really believe in Pollard, like they pay him some and put him on a 4-year deal, 3-year deal. And really they share again next year. That kind of keeps some wear and tear off the tires. And then he's, you get the last 2 years. But by then Pollard himself is going to be, the shelf life of an NFL running back. Like it goes quickly. Now we saw several guys, which was awesome this year, kind of shed that, perception. We saw Derrick Henry keep on going. We've seen guys now. Like I really do think sometimes we get overly harsh in our takes one way or another on, what's the exact age. Once a running back's at this age, I don't draft them in fantasy football. It's like, okay, it's like, I don't know. Like we see it work out well for people doing that. And then you see it work out not so well, for
right.
people drafting those players. And injuries can just be a very random thing. And that's often a big part of what's in the mix. Yes, running backs do deteriorate as they get older. Their first contract's usually the best one. It's the most productive. But again, Pollard's a guy that doesn't have a ton of wear and tear yet. So Marcus, I think it depends. Most people I think will tell you the evidence points more to age than just true wear and tear, how many touches you've had. So it will be interesting to see how the Cowboys approach it. I was looking at a mock draft though, Marcus, this is going to crack you up.
Okay.
I can't remember the site, my bad, but it had Bijan going to the Cowboys with their pick.
I have seen people kind of mocking him there, and I don't know if that's like wish casting or if people really believe it can happen.
But, it would be a rookie deal. Zeke's getting... So, the Cowboys could have options, with what they want to do. So it depends on how they're thinking through all that. I do think Tony Pollard's future will certainly, like what they think of this class and where they think the rookie running backs will go in the draft certainly will play a role. Like if they think there's someone they can, especially if there's a back they have their eye on that they think they can get in the 3rd round, right? Something like that, and not have to pony up the cash for Pollard. And they could also have recency bias. Like the contract with Zeke hasn't been great.
Right.
He's definitely gone downhill as far as providing you with the explosive rushing attempts and things like that. Those things are not a part of Zeke's game anymore. He's still really good at short yardage. He's really good at, if you got to have 4 yards, you got to have 3 yards. But like once he gets that, you can just see it. It's kind of like, well, is he getting an extra 2 or is he going to get an extra 4 on top of that? Because we know it's not going to be 30. It's not going to be to the house. So there could also be some recency bias for the Cowboys just because that contract has not been good.
Yeah, very true. Because Jerry Jones was adamant about sticking with Zeke throughout this whole thing, and you got to wonder whether or not he's, I won't say regretting it, but maybe starting to think twice about doing that again in the future. Back to our rankings here. Stephon Diggs. He's Stephon Diggs, right? Even when things don't seem to be going well fantasy-wise, you're never going to count him out. And this week, he's got a Dolphins defense that loves to play man. I love how you put yes, please in the show notes here. That tells me everything I need to know about how you feel about Stephon Diggs this week.
Yeah, when you get Diggs against the Patriots, you get Diggs against the Dolphins, it's just yes, please, because they love to run man coverage. His targets per route run against man, 33%. It's 24% against zone. So again, like these are broader concepts, folks, like what happens against zone versus what happens against man. But to truly unlock that against man, you've got to have a wide receiver that can really run all the routes that beat man, right? You got to have the comeback routes. You got to be able to run the outs. You got to be able to run those routes that, like at the top of your stem, like you create that quick separation. The quarterback's throwing it to you in time, or you've just got to have pure speed, and they put you on a drag route, and you just take off, and they, somebody can't stay with you, but you can't run those kind of routes all day long. Like that's what we'll need to see Christian Watson develop. Like Christian Watson right now, how he beats man is he just, he's running a deep cross. He's running a drag route. And all of a sudden, like if you give him a couple seconds, he's going to create separation. Where Diggs is just so like on another level, honestly, than most receivers. Like Justin Jefferson does this. is his ability against man, like, just to create that just enough separation, right? To where the quarterback feels totally comfortable going there all the time. But he also has that ability once he catches it to make you miss, and he can do more damage after. And some of his moves are so subtle on his routes, like he still has the speed to beat you over the top. So it's a really good matchup for him. He's just, and we saw it. Like, he was kind of down week 14, 7 fantasy points. The next week, 11. The next week, 5. You're like, man, what's going on with Stephon Diggs? You can't get stuck in recency bias. 23.4 last weekend against the Patriots, who use so much man.
I mean, again, Stephon Diggs is just one of those guys where it just, the blow up can happen at any time because he is such an integral part of the offense. And I think when you talk about those games, those 4 or 5 games, whatever, late in the season where he didn't necessarily perform up to our expectations, it's also because the Bills have other weapons, right? And you'll see Josh Allen kind of integrate those guys, whether it's, a Gabe Davis and Isaiah McKenzie, getting the running backs involved in the passing game as well. There are just other places to go with the football. But it always seems like in big situations when the Bills have to have it, that's when Stephon Diggs shows up. And it's the playoffs now. So this is a gotta-have-it moment for that Buffalo offense. So I expect Diggs to perform well. Speaking of guys who sort of underperformed and then showed up when the lights were brightest, Mike Evans. And we got to a point in the season where I think a lot of people gave up on Mike Evans. And I know, like, for NFL.com, he's on 99% of rosters. Not a surprise there. But only 33% of people started him when he had his huge 40-plus point game in Week 17 because people had just sort of quit on Mike Evans because he hadn't done anything for a while. So now with that kind of in our rearview mirror, but not that far away, can we say that it's okay, it's all good, it's all forgiven, and Mike Evans is back now?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to how do the Cowboys want to play against him. He did have that rough stretch. He had a 5-game stretch where he averaged 8.6 fantasy points. He had 1 catch of 20 yards or more coming into a score of 20 yards or more coming into the weekend in Week 17 when he blew up. And then he had 3 of those where we got the big plays that we're used to. Brady's had 4 all season. They've all gone to Mike Evans. Teams just have decided to not give it to him. What I think is interesting is these things still have a way of working themselves out, Marcus. Eventually, he got the right matchup. Yeah, to catch up, he really had to have it all come in 1 week. 10 catches, 207 yards, and 3 touchdowns against the Panthers. But in the end, he made it. So if you look at him with Brady, he's really not been an alpha receiver. But they throw it so much that he can still come through on his targets because he gets the big plays. The big plays have been gone this year. But if you look at him with Brady in 2020, he had a 75.0 PFF receiving grade, 19% targets per route run, 15.5 fantasy points. 2021, slightly lower PFF receiving grade, 72.3, but targets per route run were again really close, 19% the year before, 18% in 2021, and 16.4 points. So right there with the 15.5. This year, after that last week, where does he end up? Right back where those numbers are. 75.6 PFF receiving grade, so right in line with the other 2 seasons. 20% targets per route run. That's actually 2 percentage points higher than 2021. And 15.1 fantasy points per game. So 1.5 points less than what you got last year, about a half point less than what you got in 2020. So I think sometimes that's just the way fantasy works. You get a 3 or 4 game stretch, but with a player like Mike Evans, maybe the lesson is you just got to keep playing them. Now, it depends on who else you have on your roster. Like, because if you had Garrett Wilson, I totally get it. I would have started Garrett Wilson over Mike Evans as well. And you have to make those tough sort of decisions. But we'll talk more about the matchups when we get to the previews. But for Mike Evans, this week we also have the fact that we've got less games. So that moves him up the ranks. So he's in my top 10 this weekend. We've got 6 games. It's going to be boom bust, though. I will say that. Yeah. Like, you could get 5 points, but you know that you could get 30. So that's just the way it's going to go.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's one of those things with the talent profile. We know what the past history has been. That sort of gives you hope. But when you look at the day-to-day or the week-to-week, and it gets really, really frustrating. And maybe another clue should have been before that big game, Tom Brady said, I've got to do better getting him the ball. And he absolutely did. So maybe we should peg Brady and see what Tom thinks about getting the ball to Mike Evans this week. Maybe we can also ask Tom Brady what he thinks about getting the ball to Cade Otton. You've got him as kind of a punt play this week. Tight end has always been, it's just been a disaster outside of, say, Travis Kelce and maybe, a couple other handful of guys there. But Otton has had his weeks. Is this a matchup thing? Is this just a usage thing? How are you looking at Otten this week?
It's just route participation. He's taken over the lead role. No one really knows because he hasn't had a game yet. If you think back earlier in the season, he had a couple of games where we had Cameron Brate in and out of the lineup, and he played okay. He was really a borderline tight end one in those games. But as soon as Brate would come back, we would see his role would, revert back to really being a part-time player. For the last 2 games, he's been over the 80% route participation threshold that we like. So knowing that he's going to play on a team that's going to throw the ball all the time, we could get a shootout between the Cowboys and the Bucs. Like, he's a name that a lot of people are not thinking about in DFS, right? And you can get him for really cheap, depending on which, how you're going to play this slate, this weekend. Now, that's a Monday night game, so it's obviously if you're going to try to play, they've still got contests on DraftKings where you can play the whole weekend slate. It's more for something like that. But if you're playing, on the one game slate, he's a great name, because, you're looking and those you've just got to try to differentiate. So just thought we would throw him out there. Also, not necessarily a bad name. Like, if you're, you've got a couple days left to draft, over on Underdog, for these playoff best ball tournaments. And if you're at the end, and because I like taking Brady quite a bit, Marcus, like if I start off, because in these contests, you each round you have to advance. So in the wild card, you get to draft 10 players and you start 1 quarterback, you start 1 running back, you start 3 wide receivers, and then 2 wide receivers or a tight end, and then you have a flex. So you can't just draft all Eagles, you can't draft all Chiefs, because if you do, then you're not gonna have any players for the first round. Yeah, they have the best chance of getting to the Super Bowl, which is what you want. You want teams that are going to be to get you to the Super Bowl, because you want to score the most points in the final week, because that's where all the money comes in. And so a guy like Otten, I like taking Brady because he goes late in these drafts. I did one the other night where I started off with, if I go AFC with Mahomes, I want an NFC bring back somewhere. So I started off with Mahomes. I got Kelsey to come back to me in the 2nd round. Then in the 3rd round, I took Austin Eckler just because I need something to help me in the 1st round. But once I got to the later part of my draft, I went with the Bucs. I took Mike Evans, I took Godwin, Evans, and Brady all in a row. And then if you want to take a 4th guy, like Rachaad White's typically there, and then Cade Otton is the other one. And no one's thinking about him. No one is thinking about Russell Gage. But if you get to a Super Bowl, and you've got the matchup between the Chiefs and the Bucs, they somehow get there, and you have a differentiated piece like that, and you could build that roster, like you can draft that every day. You can start off Chiefs, and so you could build all sorts of different stacks with the Bucs, and so that makes it really nice. And if people just want to sweat, right? If they're looking for a sweat, maybe you've already drafted all of your contests, for best ball. Maybe you're still going to do more. Doesn't really matter. Like if you want another sweat, maybe you're like me, you need as many sweats as you can. You should go check it out over on Fantasy Life, because we have got the Fantasy Life playoff contest. It's a best ball, it's a playoff pick'em. And so you get a shot at weekly prizes, and you get to play against all of us. So you get to play against all the analysts here. We're all in making our picks. You get to do it every week. Like this week, I did take the over on the CMC rushing prop, and it's all on player props. I took the under on Geno Smith. That's all I'm telling you. I'm only telling you those 2 picks. There are multiple that are on there, but you guys can go check it out. And then ultimately, so we're going to give away prizes every week. And at the end, there's a grand prize trip to the Fantasy Football Expo in Canton, Ohio, where we were going to compete, in a live Sirius XM fantasy football draft. So one person will win that. So, Canton, Ohio, how can you not go, Marcus? I got to hang out with you there. I got to meet Marcus Grant in person last year. We had never met. We had never
met. It was awesome. Yeah, we got to meet in person. We got to hang out, and it's funny. The tweet went out earlier in the week that registration opens in about a month, and I immediately had people jumping in my DMs asking if I was going to be back, and a lot of folks just the buzz is already starting for Canton, and the drum beats are only going to get louder as we get to August. So if you haven't had a chance to go check it out, I'm throwing out the early promo for the expo in Canton. If you haven't had a chance to go, definitely check it out. Maybe the best way to do it is to do it on somebody else's dime, to win a trip to Ohio to participate in the SiriusXM Fantasy Football Draft, and just hang out with us and a whole lot of other really smart, fun people in this entire industry. That feels like a good way, though, to get into the matchups for the weekend. As I mentioned, 6 games on what's being called Super Wild Card Weekend. I need an echo or something like that behind me. Let's start with the 2 games on Saturday. Seahawks, the number 7 seed. They just squeak into the playoffs. They take on the 49ers in Santa Clara. These two teams played twice this year. The Niners won both of those matchups, and I don't know that either one was particularly close. Niners right now a 9.5-point favorite. The number is 42.5. And I mean, Dwayne, these are two teams that know each other very well. There's not going to be a lot of surprises about what either side does here because they see each other twice a year. But to me, this is as simple for the Seahawks as can they stop the run? Can they stop Christian McCaffrey? And can Geno Smith find enough holes in that 49ers secondary to actually make some plays and keep Seattle in this? Because, if the Niner defense clamps down and if Christian McCaffrey gets to do whatever he wants, this one could get ugly kind of early, I think.
Yeah, and this is the second largest spread on the slate this weekend. Number one is Dolphins at Bills. We'll talk about that one in a minute, but 9.5 points. So clearly, we do have the Seahawks as big dogs here based on what's happening, with Vegas. But I was talking about this one with Pete and Kendall over on SiriusXM this morning before hopping on the podcast. And if you do have to pick one spot where we think a legit upset could happen this weekend, the first thing you start with is quarterback, right? Do they have a quarterback? The Seahawks have a quarterback. Geno Smith has played. He's been down a little bit over the last 4 games, but overall Geno's played really well. Does he have weapons that could cause problems for the 49ers? You have DK Metcalf. You have Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett is now fully practicing this week, not even on the injury report, and he kind of popped, a nice game last week. So you've got that. We've got Kenneth Walker, a rookie running back who's played really well. He's taken over more of the passing down duties over the last couple of games with Travis Homer now on IR. So I think there's some pieces here, Marcus. And over on the opposite side, we still are talking about Brock Purdy. I know we all love him. We know Kyle Shanahan's going to scheme it up. They're going to protect him. He's got the weapons. They've got the defense. They're a very complete team. But Brock Purdy could stumble. Are we that confident? That Brock Purdy is this infallible, there's no way he could slip up. I think what the Seahawks have to try to do, I would dare them to throw the ball. I would dare the 49ers to throw the ball. I would go most teams you would not do this, but I would go all out to take away everything around the line of scrimmage. I would go all out to stop the run game. And I would say, you're going to have to bomb it to Ayuk, bro. You're going to have to beat a single coverage cornerback. And the Seahawks have some feisty corners. I know that ultimately, they haven't ended up as a good defense on the end of the season. But I think that's the way I would approach it. And if you could do that, if you could muddy the game up and say, we're not letting you throw screen passes at Debo, not happening. That's what we're playing for. That's our first read. We're going after that. You're going to still give up some big plays. But what I wouldn't want to do is don't let Purdy, just dink and dunk you down the field, and then you get tired and you're like, oh, we got to take away dink and dunk, and then he pops you over the top. I would just come out and be all out aggressive if I was the Seahawks. If they do that, and if they could maybe get a turnover early, right, kind of swing the tide a little bit, I think they do have the weapons to hang in, and this would be the game that I would pick, because I think there are just things that, and again, we're not talking about the Giants and Vikings. It's a 3-point, spread on that game. Right. We're talking about this would be an upset, minus 9.5. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think that's a fair assessment too, because when they saw each other the most recent time, Purdy was just sort of taking over. Nobody really knew what to expect. He went for 217, had a couple of touchdowns to George Kittle, which is the first really big George Kittle game we had late in the season there. And it was that situation where Shanahan made everything really easy for him, just kind of put everything out on a platter. And it was, short, easy throws, whether it was to Kittle, whether it was to Ayuk. They didn't have Deebo Samuel in that game. And they just really made it simple. And then, McCaffrey running the ball 26 times definitely helps. But I think if you are the Seahawks, it does make sense to try to take that away and see if Brock Purdy can be that guy. Now, I guess the flip side to that is, as Purdy has been starting more recently, he looks more confident. That doesn't mean he's not occasionally prone to making the kind of throw you would expect for the last pick in the draft. So that happens every once in a while. And I do think, Pete Carroll is traditionally a defensive guy. So whatever tricks he may have left in the bag, this seems like the week to try to dial them up and see what happens. And to your point about the offense, the Niners will give up some big plays in the passing game. It has happened a number of times this year. So, it wouldn't be a surprise if you see DK or Lockett get behind the defense, or maybe just find some gaps in the middle of the zone and figure out a way to operate there. So I think those are all within the realm of possibility. But again, this is one of those where you talk about the team rankings, the power rankings we talked about earlier in the week. If the Niners do what the Niners are supposed to do, this one should be a fairly comfortable victory. But we'll see. Over in the AFC, the Saturday game is the Chargers at the Jaguars. The Chargers, the 5 seed, the Jags, the 4 seed. The Jags are an underdog at home by 2 points. 47.5 is the total on that one. And we talked earlier in the week about Brandon Staley's decision to play his guys. And I went back and watched that game yesterday. And even the announcers were sort of baffled when it's mid-third quarter and Justin Herbert is still in the game, and Keenan Allen is still on the field, and Austin Eckler is still rotating in. Just a lot of confusion about that. I guess we'll see if this comes back to bite them. I mean, Mike Williams suffered an injury. Joey Bosa got banged up a little bit. We'll see whether or not Brandon Staley's Week 18 decision bites them in the first round of the playoffs. But this one, I think, is going to be a really entertaining game otherwise.
Yeah, so Bosa's practicing in full, and he's off the injury report, so that's a positive, because it is a Saturday game, so he should be good to go. Mike Williams hasn't practiced yet, and so we've got today. Today is Friday when you have a Saturday game. Yeah. So I mean, we've got one more day. We've got one more data point to look at, and so we'll see. Can he at least get out there in a limited fashion? It is the playoffs, so they could not practice him all week and then run him out there. But how confident are you going to really be? Mike Williams, if that happens. So yeah, I like this game a lot. Like this, I'm excited about this game. You mentioned like it's only, the two teams are separated by 2 points right now in the spread, with the Chargers as 2-point favorites at the Jaguars. I think this is a matchup that we've got two young quarterbacks that we're excited about with Herbert, with Lawrence. And earlier this season, we did see Lawrence get the better of Herbert. Now that was the game where Herbert had just hurt his ribs. So I think he had hurt his ribs the Thursday night before, I believe. So maybe 10 days rest whenever he was coming in to play the Jaguars, and it was a struggle for Herbert, that day. So I think it's a good opportunity to get to watch two young, quarterbacks play. I do lean to the Chargers. What's interesting is, as we were getting ready for this stuff, I'm reading different things and researching the data, and like if you go to The Athletic. Ted Wynn says the key to this matchup is the slot receiver Christian Kirk for the Jaguars. And then if you go to The Ringer, Stephen Ruiz says the key for the Chargers is their slot receiver, Keenan Allen. So apparently the slot receivers are the keys on both sides to the game. I will say, with Keenan Allen, we've talked about him some, but he's averaging 9.9 targets since he returned in week 11. I think we've mentioned that number before, but a 26% target share. So he is it's him and Eckler right now. Like that's really what the offense is. It's kind of back to the old days with the Saints when it was, it's Kamara and it's Mike Thomas. Like it's those two guys together. That's really the way the Chargers game is running right now. And oh wait, who's our offensive coordinator? Joe Lombardi. He was also there with the Saints back in the day. So running a similar style offense, two really good players that can make that work. So I think that's what the thing. If you're the Jaguars, you've got to try to take away one of those two players. You're going to have to try to do everything you can to force them to maybe let one of those guys eat and force someone else, to step up. If you're looking at the Chargers, playing against, the Jags, the Chargers defense has been much better over the last, pass coverage wise, right down the stretch. Like they started off as one of the worst teams in the league. They've really played lights out, down the stretch. So they're going to challenge the Jaguars, but we've talked about it several times, Marcus. The Jaguars may not have a superstar, but when you have Christian Kirk and you have Zay Jones stepping up the way he has, and you have Evan Ingram doing what he's doing, and then your fourth option is still a starter in this league right now, Marvin Jones. And then you've got Travis Etienne in the backfield. Like even good defenses can struggle if Trevor Lawrence is really feeling it. We saw that happen with the Cowboys a few weeks back. Like they came out and were kind of slow to start the game, the first half, and the second half, everything just started clicking, for Trevor Lawrence. And they were able to offset the pressure by the Cowboys. They were able to get all the different receivers. Zay Jones had a huge game that week, obviously, with his 3 touchdowns. So it's a scenario where I'm just excited to watch the young quarterbacks, but I do lean to the Chargers slightly here. But it's honestly, this one's a coin flip to me.
Yeah, I mean, I like the Jags just because they seem to be playing well, and we can debate whether or not momentum is real, but the Jaguars coming in off that high of winning in week 18 to win their way into the playoffs, with the Chargers coming in, having lost their final game, having some key players, leave the game with injury and just a lot of question marks. We'll see how much mindset plays into it, but at least if you're just talking about vibes, as the kids say, the Jags have much better vibes coming into this one than the Chargers do. Over to Sunday, the game that is the biggest spread on the weekend, the number 6 seed Dolphins in Buffalo for the 2 seed Bills. 13 points is the difference between these two. 43.5 is the number. They split the two games during the regular season, played in about as extreme weather conditions as you could imagine. They played early in the season when it was blazing hot down in Miami. Then they played in damn near a blizzard in Buffalo late in the season. I would hope that the weather will be somewhere in between this week, but who knows? It's Buffalo, so we'll see. Tua Tagovailoa has already been ruled out for this game as he continues just to get his health in order right now. So Skylar Thompson's going to be the starter there. And I think for the Bills, Dwayne, it's got to be similar to what you said about the Seahawks. Force Skylar Thompson to beat you. I mean, you are the better team on paper, and now they've got to start their third-string quarterback. Make Skylar Thompson be the one to beat you. Don't let him, hit a couple of deep shots down the field to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Make him have to work for it. It seems like that is an easy path to victory for Buffalo.
Yeah, and this isn't even really the Miami team. Like, the Miami is so banged up. Tua obviously is a huge component. Agree. Like, just get your health right, man. Like, it probably shouldn't play again this season. Yeah. But if you look at it, Teron Armstead didn't practice yesterday. He's questionable with a toe injury. You got Teddy Bridgewater battling the finger issue. Bradley Chubb, questionable. I mean, even their fullback is questionable. Alec Ingold, like these guys, like half their offensive line is questionable. Jalen Waddle was limited with a ankle injury in practice. Cedric Wilson, Jeff Wilson, his was just an illness, but we know Raheem Mostert is dealing with the broken thumb. Like, there's like 20 names on this list. Like, this has just been massively bad timing for the Dolphins with all the injuries. So, and I'm with you. Like, it's just, if I'm the Bills, I'm gonna, just confuse Skylar Thompson as much as I can. The Dolphins have a chance because they have Jalen Waddle and because they have Tyreek Hill. So the one way you could argue for really Miami to win would be that the Bills do get hyper aggressive with him, run more man coverage, run more blitzes, and he just gets, pops a couple and gets lucky with Jalen, and not even gets lucky. Like, he's not been good, but he's not been terrible. Like right. Skylar Thompson, they tried to protect him with the running game. They're going to probably need to do that again this weekend. But he can, I mean, would it surprise you if all of a sudden you look up and you're like, Tyreek Hill just took over the game? It could happen. Yeah. Like, he could have 2 touchdowns and it could be on 4 targets. And Jalen Waddle could have a touchdown on 3 targets. And otherwise he could have a 50% completion rate, but those 3 big plays could put them in the middle of a game. Now, I don't like this one as much as I like the Seahawks because we just feel better about Geno Smith. If we're talking about an upset, it's just tougher to get behind this one because Skylar is so young. He was a very late, pick in the draft. Like, so it's just, it's not one where you get super warm, fuzzy feelings, if I'm going with a Marcus term.
Yeah. I think that's probably a fair assessment. I think that's the, that's the one where there's always a game during the weekend where I'm like, okay, I'll be kind of keeping tabs on it, but if I need to run to like Target or something, this is the game I'm gonna be. This is probably the game where I may, run to Target if it goes the way I think it might.
I agree.
Yeah, we got the 6 seed Giants at the 3 seed Vikings. We've kind of talked about this one a little bit. It's a 3-point spread. The Vikings are the favorite at home. 48 points is the total there. We've kind of talked about a lot of the key pieces in this one. This is what I'll just say. I expect this one to be close because both these teams seem to play a lot of close games. As long as the Giants don't make any big mistakes, I think they stay in this and have a chance. I think the Vikings ultimately pull it out. But I think this one's going to be a very entertaining one.
Yeah, I agree. And if you're playing fantasy DFS this weekend, like, this is a really good game, to go after. You've got 2 bad defenses, and that is an opportunity. We're just gonna have a lot of opportunity for the points to get scored. So, I mean, look, the Giants aren't a great offense, but we saw them do well against the Vikings the last time they faced one another. So I agree. Like, this is a close one. Like, the Vikings are 3-point favorites, but they're at home, right? You pretty much get 3 points just for being a home team. So this isn't saying a lot. This is basically saying that Vegas thinks this is a neutral game. It's very evenly matched. And I think all the data tells us that.
Yeah. So, this is one, this could be a very entertaining one. This is one I'll make sure I'm back from Target, so I can, I can come in and sit down and actually check this one out in full. The last game on Sunday, it's the 6 seed Ravens at the 3 seed Bengals. The Cincinnati, an 8.5-point favorite, and it looks like Lamar Jackson will not be back for that one. All signs pointing to him missing another game, so it could be Tyler Huntley again, which the Ravens offense has not been great, not been very productive under Huntley. Meanwhile, the Bengals, sort of like last year, getting hot at the right time. They got hot at the end of last season. It carried them all the way to the Super Bowl. They're starting to get hot again, Dwayne. And this one, these are two teams that know each other. They don't like each other a whole lot. This one could be kind of physical, could be kind of brutal, but it looks like the Ravens are going to need a lot of big plays in order to stay in this one with that Bengals offense.
Yeah, I think so as well. But this is another one where the Ravens defense is pretty feisty. Like, they could end up coming up with, a plan. They know, you talked about earlier, one of the same division games where there's not going to be any surprises with the Seahawks and 49ers. There are not going to be any surprises here. And I don't know that you need surprises when you have Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd and Hayden Hurst and Joe Mixon. That's kind of the point of having all those guys, right? It doesn't need to be a lot of surprises. That's an offense that just has to go execute, right? And you've got a quarterback to make it work with Burrow. But the Ravens, they've been really good at stopping the run, so they could kind of take that away. And if they do have cornerbacks that can come through. They're not what they once were. But if you look at the Ravens over the last 4 games, if you exclude overtime play, Marcus, they're only giving up 191 yards passing per game. Now, on the season, they're giving up right around 250 per game in non-overtime play. So they've been tougher down the stretch. So I give them a fighting chance, but, it's not like, obviously the Bengals are favorites for a reason. That's who we think is going to win the game. But you know how things go in these sort of, divisional matchups when you know each other so intimately well. The problem you're going to have for the Ravens is we know Lamar Jackson is not going to play, and Tyler Huntley is still not practicing. So they have to have Tyler Huntley. Like Anthony Brown, it's not going to work. Like this line has already been creeping up, on the news with Lamar Jackson, then the news of Tyler Huntley not throwing. If we hear Tyler Huntley is not going to be in the game, like I won't be surprised if the line grows, to double digits.
Right. Yeah, so that's one to keep an eye on, the quarterback situation there in Baltimore. By the way, Roquan Smith just signing a big deal, and he's made a big difference in that Baltimore defense since he got there mid-season. The last game on the slate is on Monday night. It is the Cowboys, the 5 seed, and down in Tampa to take on the 4 seed Bucks. Cowboys a 2.5-point favorite there, number 45.5. I feel like people have been pegging this game for months. We all got the feeling when the NFC South was bad, everybody's like, you know what? The Bucks are still going to win this. They're somehow going to host a first-round playoff game. It'll probably be against the Cowboys, and either they'll be favored or they'll find a way to pull it out in the end. It seems like we've been talking about this scenario since October. So now it's come to fruition. And, I think it's going to be intriguing. I think it's going to be entertaining. The Bucks have been not great this year. The Cowboys are in a bit of a slump. Your thoughts on what you expect in this one?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on here. Potentially, the Bucks are at the beginning of heating up on offense, right? We saw what they did in Week 17 against the Panthers. They really rested their starters in the second half last weekend. In the final game, didn't really play Mike Evans at all. Chris Godwin's a guy that we've talked about a lot. Like, he can beat zone coverage. He can keep the chains moving. I think a lot of this does come down to, how do the Cowboys want to play Mike Evans? Because the Cowboys, from a coverage standpoint, early in the year, Marcus, even like up to 5-6 weeks ago, they were really one of the toughest teams to throw the ball against. However, over the last several games, they've suffered injuries. We've seen Anthony Brown leave. We saw, earlier in the season, they lost Jordan Lewis, their slot cornerback. And so they've had some injuries. They haven't lost anybody at safety, but they've had safeties playing dinged up. And then the pass rush just hasn't been quite as good. You've really had Micah Parsons, limited in practices. He hasn't quite been what he was early in the season. So there's just like a lot of, it's timing. Timing matters so much in these things. And like, you could tell yourself a story where maybe, and we only have one data point, but maybe the Bucks are about to hit their upswing. Maybe they figured something out with their offense. You look at the Cowboys and their defense it is in a downswing, right? It's on a downward trend right now. And if you look at them over the last 4 games, they've got the they've actually got the worst coverage grade right now heading into the playoffs of all the teams. If you just look at the last 4 games, 50.7. They are at a 76 PFF coverage grade on the season, which is one of the best in the league. But over the last 4, since all of these injuries have really taken their toll and the pass rush hasn't quite been what it was, like, they've struggled. They're giving up 265 yards per game through the air over the last 4 weeks. So I really do think it comes down to like, how are they going to play Mike Evans? Like, if I were the Cowboys, it would be the opposite of what we talked about, with the Seahawks and the 49ers, where, hey, you just come up and, try to take away everything and force Brock Purdy to beat you. Like, I don't want to force Tom Brady to beat me over the top. He probably will. I would like to play back. I would want to keep a safety deep, which I think is going to require, you've got to get pressure with your front four. You can't be put into a situation where you're going to need to rush 5 and 6 players to get to Brady. That's when Brady gets you. If you can stay in shell coverage and you can get pressure with 4, and this isn't just Brady, this works against most quarterbacks. So knowing that the secondary isn't suddenly going to be healed up, right? That means the pass rush for the Cowboys has to win this weekend. Micah Parsons has to have a monster game, and that's going to really be their path. If he doesn't, I'm worried because, on the offensive side also, the Cowboys are just struggling a little bit. Like if you look at Dak over the last several games, has not quite been as sharp as what we had seen. In week 18, we talked about this earlier in the week. They kept their starters out there trying to get hot, 128 yards. He didn't leave until the fourth quarter. So he hasn't been terrible before that, right? Dak, if you look at the 4 games before that, was actually pretty good, averaging 292 yards. He had touchdown passes of 1, 3, 3, 2. So maybe I'm overreacting a little bit to week 18, but it looked so bad. It's just, and again, I'm a Cowboys fan, so I've been here so many times. I've been through this so many times. And, I start to guard. I start to get guarded. I got to protect myself.
Understandable. Absolutely understandable. And you talk about making Tom Brady beat you. Plenty of people have had plenty of bad days when they came in with the theory of, we're going to make Tom Brady beat us. That hasn't really worked out for a lot of people in the last 2 decades or so. So it should be a big, fun weekend. Of course, you can go check out all that information and more over at the game hubs there on fantasylife.com. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for the newsletter as well. So the NFL offseason is going to be just around the corner, which means we're going to have free agency. We're going to have trades. Hopefully, we're going to have drafts. We're going to have a whole lot of things that are going to reshape a whole lot of offenses. And in that vein, we here at Fantasy Life, we're going to be breaking down every NFL team in what we like to call the fantasy fixers. We're going to determine what went wrong in 2022 and identify paths to improvement. First team up is the Chicago Bears. They've got the first overall pick in 2023. Matt LaMarca did a great job outlining 3 recommendations for the Bears front office. And Dwayne, I'll just run through them and you can tell me your thoughts there. 1, trade the number 1 overall pick or potentially Justin Fields because there are a lot of teams out there that need a quarterback. 2, load up on defense. They've got $108 million in cap space. A good way to bring in a whole lot of really good talent if they need to. And 3, bring the offense into the 21st century, i.e. get the passing game going off the run game. Your takeaways, though, from what Matt had about the Bears there.
No, I thought he did a really good job. And so I'm writing the next Fantasy Fixers piece. And so I was kind of jealous of LaMarca that he said, I'll take the first one. He was being a good dude. And then the Texans lost to the Bears. And because I was looking forward to doing the Bears, and now I have the Texans. and I'll be honest, like Jordan asked me yesterday, he's like, "Hey, do you have an idea for the thumbnail on this?" I'm like, "I don't know, like a dumpster rolling down the street on fire with Dameon Pierce standing in it." And Jordan's like, "Great, sounds awesome." So to kind of tease next week, you might have an idea on what the visual is going to look like. But no, I thought that LaMarca did a really good job here on this team. I agree. You now have the benefit of having that first pick. Teams are going to want to trade up because there are good quarterbacks in this class. And if you believe in Justin Fields and your top priority is an edge rusher, you can probably trade back to pick 4, pick 5, still get a really good player that you want. And that lines up really with his second point, which is to load up on defense. I do think they're going to be in the market for taking one of the top defensive ends to try to get pressure. And then if you think about it, like from a standpoint of, how much money they have, $108 million in cap space. I mean, that's a lot. Last year, you saw the Jaguars with right around 100 million, and LaMarca points this out, in the article that they spent that money and made a big turnaround. Like the Jaguars went from being one of the worst teams to now they're in the playoffs. Now they had the money to go spend on offensive weapons, which happened to be available. I think looking at what you want to do in free agency this year, it's going to be a little bit tougher, and that's why the recommendation here is to use a lot of the free agent dollars on defense. Because if we look at the receivers, we know the Bears need to improve their receivers. But we've got Jacoby Myers. These are your free agents. Jacoby Myers, Juju Smith-Schuster, Darius Slayton, DJ Chark, Alan Lazard, Marvin Jones, Mecole Hardman, Jarvis Landry. Like, of that list...
Not a great class.
Chark's the one that sticks out to me. Like, because if if you want to run the style of offense, which brings us to point 3, it's a really well done article. It all ties together. But looking at, bringing the offense into the 21st century, like, okay, let's get the passing game rolling. Well, you need the weapons to do that. And so Chark is the one name that I would add to this, like in that spending frenzy with you having so many dollars. Get that down the field threat. We've seen him really come through in that way for Detroit. They're going to move on. They've got Jamison Williams. They still have Josh Reynolds. I mean, obviously Amon-Ra doing his thing. So I like the idea of getting someone that can stretch the field out. So whenever you are a run balanced or run heavy team like they are, you've got to be able to hit the big plays over the top. And they haven't been able to do that. So then you would have Mooney comes back. He can do that some. He's a guy that you can scheme up, get into space, do screens, things like you do with Deebo Samuel. He's not the powerful. He doesn't have the power of a Deebo, right? But he's a guy, if you get him into space, he can make people miss. You have Chase Claypool that you added, but I think the other thing is in the draft, like they've got to find another wide receiver as well. Yeah. So those would be the only 2 things that I would add to this. I think you got to at least go after one receiver. I don't really want Mecole Hardman because to me, he feels more like a lesser Darnell Mooney, to be honest, like a really fast player, but he's never developed into someone that can run a route tree. You don't need just a player that's just a gimmick. Right. I think you need, if you're going to spend money in free agency on a receiver, I think you want someone that can be out there on the field, 90% of the plays. And I don't think Mecole has shown us that he can do that. The rest of these guys are really possession guys, like Lazard. Okay. Jarvis Landry. Okay. I think, I wouldn't tie a lot of money up in any of these. Like Juju Smith-Schuster's he's just a guy at this point in his career. Jacoby Myers, nice possession receiver. I'm fine with adding one of these other guys, Marcus, but I would not spend a lot. If you're going to spend a lot, like you want one, that has the game-breaking potential. I think the only one on this list that can be a full-time player and give you that is Chark.
There's really not a lot out there at the free agent market and wide receiver, but the Bears do have to try to do something to help out the guy they believe, at least for now, can be their franchise quarterback. So we'll keep an eye on what they do throughout the postseason, and go check out all the Fantasy Fixer articles as they pop up on a regular basis here on FantasyLife.com. In the meantime, that'll do it for this edition of the podcast. We appreciate you hanging out with us as always. Plenty of football to talk about next week. We'll be back with you then. Enjoy the playoffs, everybody. For Dwayne, I am Marcus. This has been the Fantasy Life Podcast. Enjoy Wild Card Weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.